Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Rachel Schreiber. I'm the director of the Division of Humanities and Sciences here at CCA, and Humanities and Sciences and Fine Arts is co-hosting this spring's Narrative Interactions series of grad events in relation to the Graduate Lecture Series. And we are very happy tonight to have our own, we'll claim him, right? Our own Juvenal Acosta. And I'll introduce him briefly and then turn it over to Juvenal. Juvenal is a fiction writer and poet, and he also holds a PhD in comparative literature from UC Davis. His edited collections of Mexican poetry have been published by City Lights. He's collaborated on a number of projects with artists, artist books, and other projects like that. His novels include The Violence of Velvet and The Tattoo Hunter. About the latter, a reviewer for the San Francisco Chronicle wrote, "If Michel Foucault wrote fiction, he might have composed something resembling The Tattoo Hunter." Juvenal grew up in Mexico City, and I learned today from Jody Redmond that he has been teaching at CCA since 1999. So please welcome Juvenal.
Thank you for coming. I don't trust my improvisation skills, so I decided to write my lecture. So I'm going to read, then I'll be happy to talk and try to answer any questions you might have. The tentative title for this essay is Seeing the Seduction of Narration. There are many possible ways to begin the writing of a story, but this point of departure should not be confused with the origin of the story itself. The formal beginning of a story usually is not the same as in real life. The genesis of the story can be a mystery even to the writer. I would suggest that most stories begin to be articulated as language the moment the writer can see them. Once we have opened that window, once we have glimpsed into that possibility and people begin to have faces and a voice begins to account for those lives, then we can begin to attempt to convey what we want the reader to see. But the storyteller has to see it. Seeing is the first condition. The opening of The End of the Affair by Graham Greene goes like this. A story has no beginning or end. Arbitrarily, one chooses that moment of experience from which to look back or from which to look ahead. This novel stands as one of the greatest novels for novelists of all time because it translates accurately into fiction the process of loving and writing under the German Blitz on London, that is, seeing and recording. By loving, I mean the process of experiencing supreme ecstasy followed by unbearable loss. By writing, I suggest the credible translation of a convoluted love experience into a plausible fiction. Marguerite Duras, his contemporary, understood the process as one permeated by hesitance and reticence. Quote, "Sometimes I realize that if writing isn't all things, all contraries confounded, a quest for vanity and void, it's nothing. That if writing isn't all things, that if each time, something happened with my quote. Anyways, I'll continue, I'll move on. Yet a narrative that comes from this murky pond is not necessarily doomed to opacity. There was a time when certainty regarding the things we saw was a condition to be a faithful interpreter of reality. Now we live in a time with fewer conditions, and it is possible to imagine a narrative that might start and end in ways some of us will never be able to comprehend. An absolute narrative of the unexpected. I also imagine this great narrative as one we could even find relevant, a great web of stories we keep on telling each other so we can learn and cope, stories to expose and exhibit ourselves to the eyes of strangers, stories to convince and disagree, to conceal and deceive, to believe and to ignore. A great all-encompassing narrative in which all of us share a fragment, a line of dialogue, a vision, and a hope. A literary narrative is not so different from other kinds of narrative. It involves a master teller, a fabricator, a godlike liar, a manipulator of facts, a sophisticated deceiver, a weaver of nouns. What is narrative if not a marriage of consciousness and history, an affair between the world and the sense of sight, a way of trying to balance what we have lost and what we need to create so the loss will be made tolerable thanks to the poetry of beauty and redemption. It can be, you could say, a way of making things better, or none of the above. I like to think of storytelling as a way of understanding trauma. If we're going to be hurt, damaged, or injured as a direct result of living, then we need a way to make sense of all that pain. Yet, we don't write to be healed. We don't tell stories to be healed. Writing is the opposite of therapy. Writing is poetry, and poetry hates therapy. We read to make sense of chaos, and we write to understand the human mess. We write to understand the wound. We want to explain the scar, appreciate the complexity of that embroidering on the skin, appreciate the texture of the ribbons on our back, on our hands, and our eyes. We open the book to see what the story will present as evidence of that experience, and in the act of seeing, hopefully find the elusive trace of salvation, even though we know that seeing can also kill us. Often what we read will hurt us, and this is why reading should also be considered a dangerous affair of the imagination. We see in order to discover, and we see best through the gates of language, through the filters of nouns, the cues offered to us by metaphors and symbols. We don't really see the world until we begin to understand it through the poetry and the fiction gathered in two canons, the one we inherit and the one we choose. Culture gives us its canon, and it is a canon that is often imposed on us at places like this one. But we are not powerless before the imposition. We decide whether to take it as it is or modify it according to our own desire and needs. Even as we learn to read, we learn to choose and discriminate. In 1979, in the opening lines of the White Album, John Didion wrote the following sentences. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder of five. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely, especially we're writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria which is our actual experience, or at least we do for a while. Telling a story supposes not just the ability to account, but the will to listen. And what are we supposed to listen? Because I was raised out of the border, I often thought that to be a writer, I had to listen first to the whispers of the dead, my dead people I loved because I had their blood, and dead people I loved because I had drunk their blood as I read them. Novelists from the 19th century, poets from the turn of that century into the next, storytellers from Russia, France, and Argentina, Mark Twain, Javier Villaurrutia, Juan Rulfo, and Charles Baudelaire. I love my dead authors because they showed me a world I longed for. When you're a kid, life is always elsewhere, and reading is a lesson in longing. I am talking, of course, about the act of reading as one of absolute surrender, and surrender can only take place as the outcome of seduction. Poets and writers are at a disadvantage unknown to musicians and painters. The song and the painting affect the reader in a manner that is direct and spontaneous. They seduce with barely a swift transition from one state of consciousness into the next. There is only a second between the musical phrase or the image on the canvas and the epiphany. To seduce is to let the other glimpse into something unattainable and make her think for a second that it can be hers. I seduce you into paradise, into truth, into believing that poetry is fit for your eyes and your hands. I seduce you, the storyteller suggests, into longing for that which is not visible outside the walls and the windows of your room. I seduce you into believing in revenge or redemption, in hope or total and devastating solitude. I will send my dogs and my demons your way. I will let you taste a drop of joy and shower you afterward with despair. The Mexican poet Octavio Paz said, "Deserve your dreams." I say, deserve your books, deserve the epiphany, the revelation, the dream the epiphany gave you at the end of the day, deserve your fashionable fiction, your romance, your crappy young adult novel, your illegible poem, but also deserve what you have educated your senses to deserve. It's all about seeing even further and reading between the ink and the blood, the lyrical glory or the unbearable bullshit of the one who wants you to know what is going on to happen in the last chapter, the last paragraph in the last page, for we still respond to what Ian Forster called the primitive instinct in the audience, our absolute need to know what is going to happen next. We all are, he said, Scheherezade's husband. We have surrendered our power so we can know what's going to happen next. I wrote my first novel wanting to do this, to read what I had not read in the books of my contemporaries and to seduce by showing what I had already seen. Back in the mid-90s, I noticed that my fellow Americans had decided to cover their bodies with tattoos. I looked at them with wonder all the way from here to New Orleans. I became intrigued by the possibilities of this unique kind of branding in a fiction, and I kept on writing a short story that after a month had become too long to be a short story. I called that novel The Tattoo Hunter. This paragraph hopefully illustrates the point I'm trying to make. My conscience is tattooed. My tattoos are not on my skin. Not true, I have kisses and scratches tattooed on my back. I have tangos tattooed upon the nostalgia of a mouth, poems tattooed on my apocalyptic anxiety. My chest was tattooed forever by a woman of water who inscribed upon it her name with menstrual blood. A tattoo always tells a story. Sometimes the story is not of a tattoo, but of a scar, but the scar is a tattoo. The scar lining upon the skin. The tattoo is a freely chosen scar. Our love stories leave scars upon the skin of the kiss, upon the alcohol we drink, upon the uncertainty of the days that go by. Each morning our nakedness shows us those scars, but the tattoo is a marking of sovereignty upon the skin, an exclusive territory of shadows, a shadow of light, a bullfighting ring of epidermic calligraphy and melancholy, calligraphy of sadness, of rituals fulfilled in the name of that modern pain created by the anxiety for freedom. I have tattooed on my retina a painting by Magritte, a regret on my esophagus, a tongue on my crotch, a silence on the decade of the 70s. I have tattooed on my throat the words I did not say, the ones I spit, the ones that live in the uncertain future of my unborn children. Tattoos of semen in the back of lovers, of pointless one-night stands, of lubricants in the vagina of an eternally sad woman, of red wine dripping down the breast of a woman in a hotel. Tattoo or scar of a woman I met in a bar, of 10 women I met in 10 bars and loved me in the motels of drunkenness. Tattoo or scar of faked orgasms, of condoms strewn on the floor, of beer, of exchanged telephone numbers in fleeting napkins. Scar of the solitude of the end of the century. Let me be your love. Let me be your tattoo. The people I'm supposed to descend from, the Aztecs, called poetry in Xochitl, in Cuicatl, flor y canto in Spanish, flower and song. Flower and song, a symbolic and linguistic unity, were earthly invocation of the divine. A unique way in which a priest, a prince, or a king, for you had to have a high social status to have the right to poetry, had to address the powerful pre-Hispanic deities in rituals intended to honor and understand the mysterious way of the cosmos. The spiritual life of the Aztec nation was supported by a complex system where war, religion, and poetry were ever present in their daily lives. Around the same time, from the 13th to the early 1500s, poetry was flourishing as well in other regions of the world. In Persia, for instance, Jalal al-Din Muhammad Rumi, otherwise known as Rumi, was writing poems that centuries later made it into the popular cultural canon of the late 20th century via Hallmark greeting cards a fact we should not blame on the mystic poet, who surely did not have the intention of achieving such dubious success. Sufi poetry was also concerned with the divine. In the meantime, in Spain, a nation that in the 1300s had no idea it would end up crashing into this continent 100 years later, poetry was dominated by the mystics. Other mystic poets of great caliber, such as Meister Eckhart, St. Francis of Assisi, Guido Cavalcanti, and St. Thomas of Aquinas, were not in Spain but in Italy or even Germany. Further east, India and Japan did not lag behind in the unique relationship their poetry had with God. Poets all around the globe sang the praises of Krishna, Allah, Buddha, Jesus and his mother, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, et al. Poetry was flower laid at the divinity's feet, and melody sung to please the ears of gods and goddesses to obtain favors, absolution, redemption, faith, and promise of eternal life. Poetry became the universal way to be able to get a glimpse of heaven on earth, the possibility of being granted a vision of paradise. What other reason could we have for loving God if not to see his or her face and see the gates of paradise opening before our astonished and grateful eyes? Even in dreams, that other half of joy, that other half of consciousness, fear, and pleasure, we find that our greatest frustration regarding dreams comes not from being able to recall what we saw in them, that most primitive and pleasurable kind of storytelling. Because writing is usually concerned with the present as it keeps a meaningful connection to the past, poetry became a way of recording the obsessions and the anxieties of each particular society that produced it. These that poets' obsessions, philosophical questions, anxieties, and fears are largely ours in present day. God, who for many of us has transfigured himself into nature, technology, science, war, and sex. Back then, poetry dealt with war when it did not deal with God, and poetry dealt with sex when it did not deal with the other two. The great poets, Homer, Shakespeare, etc., dealt with all of them in the same body of work, and this is part of why we call them great and still read them today. It was also during this period of time between the 13th and 16th centuries known in Europe as the Middle Ages, and on this continent as the last chance to have a good time before the white men with beards arrived, that poetry went through a major formal transition and became something else. A creature that, excited about its recent mutation, found itself not anymore the official means of worship, but the powerful and efficient vehicle for the telling of a story. I imagine this amazing mutation, one that had to take place in a syncretic way in many regions of the world, could have taken place like this somewhere in a little Spanish hostel lit by torches and candles. I have chosen Spain as an example because this is the place that gave birth to the modern novel. It is nighttime, and some pilgrims along the Camino de Santiago are drinking from mugs of wine and munching on a rough loaf of bread and chunks of cheese as they share road stories at the end of a long day. After a couple hours, one of them, a toothless and dusty old man of 40, tells the others that his traveling companion, Francisco Garcia, with whom he fought a battle against the Moors when they were young, knows by heart some beautiful romances de frontera, and he asks him to recite them for the audience's pleasure. This particular kind of poem deals with the adventures of soldiers of the crown who fight to protect the borders of the kingdom from infidels and criminals. Francisco Garcia begins the poem, and everybody in the room, even the patron and the maid who serves the drinks, listen with utmost attention. But after 5 or 6 stanzas, Garcia forgets the rhyme. He's either too tired or he has drunk just a bit too much. It does not matter, friends, he tells his audience. I might have forgotten the poem, but I remember very well what the poem is about. I know the story. And he goes on explaining to his listener what the poem is about and what it is that these people, those Spanish soldiers fighting Muslims in the poem, not quite characters the way we know characters to be, but simply people in the story do. And in the process of liberating the facts of the anecdote, the place and the people in the story, from the gorgeous cache of rhyme and meter, our friend Señor Garcia creates a story outside of the conventional boundary of poetry. He accidentally invents a kind of narrative fiction or a prototype of narrative fiction derived from poetry that already contains most of its conventional elements in a primitive form that we still consider as necessary when we think of contemporary narratives. And this is where the plot thickens. Among the travelers, there is an abogado, a lawyer, who is listening to Mr. Garcia's story. He's not a pilgrim. He's on his way to attend some legal business in Compostela, and as he listens to Francisco, he drinks a glass of robust Rioja paired with slices of jamón ibérico and manchego cheese. He likes the story about the soldiers fighting Moors and appreciates the soldiers' effort to finish it regardless of the rhyme. So when he retires to his room, being the only one who knows how to read and write, the lawyer decides to jot down on a piece of paper what he can remember from the account given by the fellow traveler and include it in a letter he's writing to his brother in Seville. As he translates into prose the broken poetry and the facts he can remember from the traveler's account, the lawyer becomes, by the miraculous grace of chance, one of our first fiction writers, the accidental creator of fictional prose. You were to imagine this humble origin for prose surrounded by smelly and dusty people who sat around a table to eat cheese while drinking cheap red wine, then we might agree with Milan Kundera, the Czech French writer who, discussing Don Quixote, reflects upon this wonderful feature of prose, its ability to convey the world of the everyday with immediacy and clarity. Prose, he says, the word signifies not only a non-versified language, it also signifies the concrete, everyday, corporeal nature of life, so that to say that the novel is the art of prose is not to state the obvious. The word defines the deep sense of that art. Probably held by this advantageous condition that allowed them to address the mundane and the everydayness of human life, love stories, romances, chivalric stories, and war accounts became the successful stories of the 15th and 16th centuries, and soon came to arouse far more interest than mystic poetry, for reasons that must be obvious to everyone who on any given Sunday chooses to spend his afternoon at the movies or watching a football game instead of going to church. For this reason, these popular fictions became dangerous. They corrupted the faith and the imagination of the people, and the church advised against them. They were indeed so dangerous that sometime in the late 1500s, a man who spent his evenings in a village that now we know is located about 80 kilometers from Madrid, Villanueva de los Infantes, went mad after reading too many of these bestsellers from the late Middle Ages and decided to become a knight-errant himself. The man, Alonso Quijano, never existed, but Don Quixote de la Mancha exists in the collective imagination of humanity as one of the most earnest representations of purity and romantic foolishness. Cervantes authors with Don Quixote the first novel of modernity. More than 100 years before, the first English language novels, Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders, were published. Not a minor achievement for a one-armed war veteran. We could say then that prose, narrative prose, is the result of the perversion of a form, poetry transformed, metamorphosed into a different kind of language. If narrative fiction in prose is a bastard genre, a malformation of poetry, a natural deviation from its pure origin, then one of its greatest gifts had to be that of freedom. It does make sense that the first math novel about the math reader became the greatest and most influential example of the delirious freedom with which a writer can undertake the writing of a book. What we call metafiction, the disappearance of the author, the story within the story, the self-referential narrator, etc., is not anything we invented after Tel Quel back in the 60s gave us permission to destroy or at least deconstruct the novel. The novel itself, as conceived by Cervantes, began with all these features. And since they are part of its original identity, this very fact gave us the freedom to borrow and steal from any other genre in order to tell our stories. I love this freedom because it was born out of an impulse to play and out of a formal perversion. Prose, a mutation of meter and rhyme with a different set of rules, but with a similar purpose, to entice, to praise, and ultimately to seduce. The other book we novelists love to reference is The Arabian Night Entertainments, a compilation of tales that include many modes of poetry and narration: odes, comedy, poetry, prayer, historical tales, fable, tragedies, and so on. The implied metaphor of the book could not be richer. We tell stories to survive. We narrate to stay alive. We seduce with stories. Scheherazad's purpose is to engage the interest and the curiosity of her husband, the great Shahryar, to keep death at bay, to defeat the imminence of death, to seduce the king with the stories in order to defeat death, which must be the ultimate seduction of life over the uncertain question of eternity. Just like Don Quixote's lineage can be traced to older narratives from the high and late Middle Ages, such as Malory's Morte d'Arthur, the Amadis de Gaula and Tirant Blanche, the Arabian Night Entertainments, or the 1001 Nights, which is not a book written by any individual author, but a compilation of stories organized by numerous editors, translators, and scholars, has its probable origins in much older myths and legends from India, Persia, and Syria. It does not take a lot of work to figure out how stories transform themselves and how these mutations are affected by the lives and the environments of those who tell them, including technology. The rise of the novel was achieved thanks to the printed book. The immediate popularity of Don Quixote had to do with the fact that the first translations of the novel, published originally in two parts, in the first one in 6004 and the second one in 604, the second one in 615, were published in English as early as 1600, in French in 1614, in Italian in 1622, in German in 1648, and in Dutch in what came to be the very first illustration of the book in 1657. This particular edition needs to be singled out as the one that gave us, for the first time, a visual representation of these iconic characters. From that moment, we became intimately seduced by the possibility of actually seeing the faces of the people we had only been able to imagine up until then. Perhaps this moment signaled the beginning of a long tradition that eventually mutated into the film adaptation of a literary work, the comic and the graphic novel. It took one artist's initiative to figure out that our eyes needed that extra incentive to go into the dream of the narration. Children, who are the contemporary equivalent of those proto-readers of illustrated novels, know well how important it is to be able to see their heroes. My own son, who is now 5 years old, rushes my reading of the Magic Treehouse books so we can get to those pages where he can actually see Jack and Annie with the tiger, the pirate ship, or the herd of buffaloes. The early coming together of text and visual image in the case of Don Quixote prefigures the work of illustrators from the 19th century like Gustave Doré, who illustrated scenes from works by Rabelais, Balzac, Milton, and Dante. Those illustrations of the 1860s French edition of Don Quixote came to give us the now canonical image of the noble Spaniard and his sidekick Sancho Panza. I have little doubt in my mind that without these familiar images, our relationship to that book would be very different. I was one of those children who found the coupling of image and text seducing. The book that I rescued from those years is an anthology of Russian folk tales that my maternal grandmother gave me, a very beautiful and heavy book called Baba Yaga and Other Stories. It pains me now not to be able to give that book to my son because it disappeared from my shelf somewhere along the way, but I remember the fine work of those illustrators who made the bewitching of words even more terrifying. I learned a special kind of fear reading those pages. But in my case, the love affair with images in books did not last long. I discovered soon that the images given to me by these illustrators did not match the mental images I had created on my own. The Rio Frio Bandits, a novel that I read when I was about 11 years old and had around 1,100 pages and no illustration. This was the earliest triumph of my imagination. Manuel Paino, its author, took me back to the Mexico of the late 1800s, where I taught myself to see it. After that, Dumas, Dickens, and others became my way of making mental movies out of sentences on the page. I eventually came to the personal conclusion that my own mental images were far more interesting. Just like some kids become passionate readers of comics because they're haunted by the combination of text and illustration, I became a radical reader of books without illustrations because I happened to prefer my own visual version of the facts. I rejected any book that offered me a face that could interfere with my own idea of what that single face should look like. Seeing in fiction had to be invented because every single formal change of adaptation in the novel is intimately connected with the existential mood of its historical context, something as familiar to us who grew up with cinema and TV as the scene in a story did not exist in narrative fiction until the 1830s. Kundera again. Narration is recollection, therefore a summary, a simplification, an abstraction. The true face of life, of the process of life, is found only in the present moment. But how to recount past events and give them back the presentness they lost? The art of the novel found a solution, presenting the past in scenes. A scene, even when recounted in the grammatical past tense, is ontologically the present. We see and hear it. It unfolds before us here and now. When they were reading Fielding, his readers became auditors, fascinated by a brilliant man who held them breathless with what he was telling. Balzac, some 80 years later, turned his readers into spectators watching a screen, a movie screen before the fact, on which the novelist's magic made them see scenes they could not tear their eyes away. Kundera goes on to quickly explain Balzac's magic as the result of plausibility and detail. To show, through accurate description became primary condition for this new deal between reader and writer. Ver para creer, I heard when I was growing up in Mexico. To see in order to believe. Seeing, of course, is the other side of the coin of meaning. Ver para creer. Seeing is believing. But often we see better when we cannot see and are forced to imagine. This is, of course, the charm of seduction, which is always a fiction. We're seduced not by reality, but by promise and speculation. Seduction is fantasy, not fact. We're unusually enticed by possibility. And since this word has taken a prominent place in this talk, let me finish by saying what I mean by it. I'm not talking about sexual seduction. I am talking about the strict sense of the term, which comes from the Latin seducere. Se means apart or away, and ducere means to lead, to take away, to lead away. The term does not acquire its major sexual connotation until the 1500s in France, when its original meaning is transformed from to lead away to lead astray, as in being corrupted, tempted, into sin, into perdition. I rescue its original meaning to suggest that one of the richest functions of the novel, in this particular case, or narratives in general, fictions that have taken the forms of film, plays, comics, etc., is precisely to take us away, but not to lead us into perdition, though sometimes they do, but also into joy and wisdom and laughter and pleasure, and above all pleasure, as life is too short and pleasure too ephemeral. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to try to answer some questions. If you have any questions. Yes?
Can you expound a little bit more on what you just said about we see better when we see, when we are not able to see, or we use our imagination? What do you mean by that?
I probably mean that the illustration, or any visual representation of anything is already loaded with its own meaning, with its own codes. And that when we're forced to try to imagine something of which have no idea, the way it looks, then that image can be more intriguing, far more complete, and it can fulfill our expectations of that thing in a different way. And that, to me personally, of course, this is all my own personal point of view, that brings about a series of advantages over representation that is conceived by someone else of the same object. I also think that there might be something that's a little bit, I don't know, the idea that there are things in the world that are not visible, that we cannot see, but they're there, that you experience through different means. And I'm not talking necessarily about religion or any kind of mystic experience. Just saying that we're being forced to believe our senses, believe in the power and the accuracy of our senses too much. And that maybe there are things that we can know about reality when we cannot, when we don't subject that connection to reality exclusively through the dictatorship of our own senses. Yes.
I really enjoyed this account of the birth of modern comedy.
Thank you.
And I wondered what you think about the possibility or probability of that. This was sort of happened many, many times, and that we have this historical story in Spain, but that the poet forgetting on more or less inventing those narratives may have happened.
I guess that my belief is that some of the most interesting things that we have in life happen just by accident, and that there is no great project behind the eventual apparition of great ideas. No, they just happen in a random way. For instance, the web. I'm not the first one who has pointed out that the idea of the internet was first proposed by Jorge Luis Borges in one of his short stories, The Aleph. And the Aleph is, a beautiful concept. I don't know where he got it from, but in this story, Borges talks about this. He's telling the story of a bad poet who owns this house and a cellar, and when you go down into the cellar, there is a series of steps, and right next to one of those steps, there is a little place where you can find a circle in the about the size of this coin. If you go and try to see what you can see through this kind of window, you're able to witness every single thing that's happening in the universe, in every single place, not only in the present, but in the past and in the future. You can see everything. And someone, again, I did not point it out first, but someone already, wrote a very interesting analysis of this, comparing how the web precisely does that. This great interconnection of everything through time, space, places, the hyperlink. I don't understand how the web works, but I understand the image that Borges is trying to convey. What's amazing here is not just the concept of the web as imagined by Borges, but the irony that the story suggests, because the poet who owns this house where the Aleph can be found is a terrible poet. And the only use he can imagine for this Aleph is to write a poem that tells the history of the world. But the guy is a bad poet. So Borges who is himself the protagonist of the story, is very upset because he thinks that, that you have this beautiful gift and this is the way you use it. So there is another story by Borges that's also very interesting because it plays with this idea of the wonderful gift bestowed on someone who doesn't know how to use it, and that's Funes, his memory, or Funes the Memorious one, depends on the translation. Here you have an Uruguayan peasant in the 19th century who has the gift of memory. He can remember everything he sees after an accident, after he suffers an accident, which is also interesting. So this man can stay in bed remembering what he did the day before, second after second after second, until he completes the 24 hours of that day. And again, here you have someone who doesn't know what to do with that wonderful gift. So sometimes I imagine that maybe, we're given these wonderful gifts and we don't know how to use them. And, we do. I mean, I'm talking about singing. I think singing, if you're a blind person, singing has to be the most wonderful gift that anyone can have. And how do we underuse our sense of sight? How do we underuse our sense of taste, of smell? Yes.
Ask a short question and a longer one.
Yes.
The short one is, which Magritte image is it that is tattooed on the retina of yours, or is it on the retina of your character's eye?
That character probably was thinking about this painting. I think it's owned by the Berkeley Museum of Art, the Kiss. Now those two masked persons kissing through the fabric. Yeah.
So it's connected maybe somehow to my longer question, which is, I think that the things that you're saying about sight and images are very provocative for thinking about writing in an art school and this context.
Yes.
And so I'm curious if you might talk about, I almost see it as though you're speaking of a kind of productive ambivalence towards imagery. I wonder what you think about that phrase, but I'm also in a very practical or material way curious about what it's like when you collaborate with artists. How that tension plays itself out between your word. I imagine it's between your words and their images.
Yes. I've published a few books with photographers and with painters. But part of the deal was that we would not be trying to illustrate each other. That if there was a way for these two things to come together, then we would try to get to that kind of flows, joining into creating something else. And I'm aware that I'm talking about illustration at a place where we teach illustration, and some of my dear students are illustrators, but I don't have a problem with comics or with graphic novels. I'm just saying that for this particular reader, the images that I create of Madame Bovary or whoever are much better than the face of Isabelle Huppert on the screen. And I like Isabelle Huppert. I don't think there needs to be a conflict. No? I think that there is a space for everyone, for music and text, for illustration and text, for anything. Yeah, but I'm very traditional in that sense. Yes.
Well, just to sort of continue in that vein, and it sounds like it's the sort of one-to-one relationship of the pretense of a one-to-one relationship and the preemptiveness of a one-to-one relationship between a literary narrative and a visual corollary to that's inadequate or reduces both in some ways, and that and yet there are also, I mean, you talked about being disturbed by the way that the image failed in relation to your own powers of imagination and projection. And yet, like, when I'm thinking of children's books, a certain number with maybe, you know, rather old, beat up volumes, it was always intriguing to me because sometimes the images weren't situated in the book where the text, where the story was being, you know, where it should be, you know. So there was this exaggerated kind of gap between the narrative, the verbal, the storytelling, and the imaging of it. That, you know, 10 pages later, you've kind of forgotten that the dog had a thorn in its paw, you know, and you rediscover this dog with the thorn in the paw, and you're reading something totally different. And I always found that kind of disturbing and in some ways, you know, not quite fair, but also kind of interesting. Like all of a sudden, this disruptive thing appears, and it's of a different order, and it does relate, but it doesn't relate right.
Right.
So, I mean, I wonder whether, you know, in the failure of the image to correspond with or adequately resonate with the word, it isn't, you know, one of the experiences of reading that could be conceived of as a perverse pleasure.
I like that very much. Yeah. I was lucky to get a full 1869 French edition of Balzac, one of the first complete works of Balzac, and with wonderful illustrations. And my complaint was that they didn't have enough. They had 1 or 2 per novel. So maybe I wanted more illustrations. No, 1 was not enough. Maybe I wanted a graphic novel, you know. But back in the 1960s, growing up in Mexico, I only had comics, and they were fantastic. We had great Mexican comics. And I read a lot of those comics. But then, like I said, something happened, and I lost interest for the graphic representation of people. And I wanted just the mental movie to be fully... Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. Yes, Ignacio.
Very interesting to reading when I was good that I got it. And I wanted to ask you about the shift in with poetry, and then shift into the novel, and then of course into the vision. And it seems that there are these kind of like different moments of expression that also correspond to certain historical moments as well. So if you could perhaps, you know, just amuse us a little bit with a reflection on that, because, you know, the oral, the textual, the visual, and the extent to which we are somehow in melancholic relation with each other in some ways, you know. When we have too much image, we long for the text or the poetic essence. And when we have too much of the other, we long for the other. What is about that? And that to do with perhaps with technologies, techniques, but also social and economic moments.
I think that was the case back in the late Middle Age, and especially after the Spaniards made it to America. Remember that Cervantes writes Don Quixote under the influence of that new revelation. No? So I think that there is fatigue, no, that has to do with the realizations that there are other things outside your immediate context. There is a fatigue where people don't really want to surrender all their expectations and desires to only the church, no, and the crown. So secular narratives and the the novel was a perfect instrument for secular narratives that deal with war and that deal with romance, found a very fertile ground, and this made possible for someone like Cervantes to tap into something that was really extraordinary for the time, no? Which is, this man who lives, at a moment where you don't really leave your place, goes out into the world and explore, with what makes this novel unique, explore the psychological depth of a character for the first time, no? Because before Don Quixote, all characters were rather flat. No, we really didn't know what was going on inside of their minds, inside of their hearts. So here you have someone who is very, very complex, and who establishes a very complex relationship with each one of the persons he meets along the way. So I think that this leaving home, Cervantes going out into the world, is a very powerful metaphor, not just for this particular type of nobleman in this type of economics, but also for all of us at the time. No? You want to get away. Life is elsewhere. It's a little bit like what I said about being young. If you think of that young reader, that we were back then, that life was always elsewhere, and you go back to the youth of all of us as readers, then you can kind of make an interesting comparison between these two stages. We used to be young back then and during the 15th, 16th century, and we wanted to get away, and Cervantes did that for us. Does that, I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, it was just simply a reflection on that. I wasn't after a particular.
And I think that also had to do with this transition from poetry into prose.
Right, that's also what.
Like Kundera says, prose is very good at dealing with the everyday stuff. Poetry, we were used to dealing with poetry only with the sublime. God, really deep. Ideas about ourselves and God, and that's what happened back then. And poetry did indeed free us from those constraints. You could just talk about things. Yes.
I wanted to go back to a little bit of the discussion about the image in the text, because you teach a fiction and film class, and I wonder if you explore that tension with your students a lot about what they read versus what they then see.
Yes. We Tread the Road by Cormac McCarthy a couple of weeks ago, and we watched the film last week. And it's, I like the film. I like this guy. He made two films that I love, Lawless and The Preposition. It's a filmmaker from Australia. But ever since I read Cormac McCarthy, I owe him many nightmares. Some of the worst things that I, will bring into my deathbed come from reading Blood Meridian and The Road. One of the interesting things that the man, the father in the novel, tells the kid when he keeps him from seeing the horrors that are taking place along the road, he tells him, I don't want you to see because you will keep those things inside your mind. And I haven't seen, yes, I've seen some very powerful movies, but this movie in particular does not achieve that kind of intensity that the novel achieves, that darkness. I'm not kidding you, I'm seriously traumatized by images from Cormac McCarthy books. I'm not going to get into them because if you read The Man, you know what I'm talking about, but it's pretty horrific. And very few filmmakers can impress me, can affect me in that way. So even though I love the idea of film adaptation, I really like it. I've always enjoyed it. It is rare that I found a film that is as good as the novel in terms of that richness of its images. Yeah.
That's so interesting because I was thinking while you were talking about illustrations that I hate to see films of books that I love because they get too fixed visually.
Yes.
You know, and so is it, if you hadn't read the novel first, is it about the translation, or is it something inherent in the difference between the forms?
No, poetry is what gets lost in the translation. No?
Well, there's also the script, which is the text itself, and people don't think about that in the process of moving from words, concepts, to what's on the screen with actors. It's this whole middle passage, which is a script, another text. And we forget about that as a text itself. So this is.
It also has to do with the fact that a lot of negotiation takes place in the making of a film that doesn't in the writing of a novel. A novelist can control 100% a setting, a description, character of the people inside of the books, and you cannot really do that in film unless you're one of these very powerful filmmakers who can do it. Otherwise, it's very hard. Yes.
I think that's such a great. I think people wonder about it a lot. I know I do, about why is it that we're so disappointed so frequently with illustration, or with any kind of image, whether it's film or illustration, from our own images created mentally that are evoked by the text. And it makes me wonder about the nature of the media of a written text as opposed to images of any kind, because that written text is more polysemous, so it lends itself to so many different kinds of imaginative encounters, because each individual will meet that text with their own personal baggage, if we want to put it that way. Whereas the images that we see are one person or a collective, collection of people's interpretation of that, and it takes away from our own ability to see the encounter that we had, which is very personal. And so it seems like that goes back forever, in a sense. That tension has always been there and probably always will.
Right. The other thing is that a course like this one, film and fiction, would be very different if a filmmaker were the one to choosing which films to show and what books to read. Sometimes you have really good films adapted from not so great novels. And I've read a lot on this topic. And if you look at the canon of films that critics consider successful adaptations from novels, the list is not as exciting as it could be. Yes.
Well, I mean, I think I've been really interested in, when you started talking about the formation of prose from poetry, that story that's been brought up a few times. That started getting me thinking about more technology and what we're seeing now. And as a person who rides public transportation, I used to get great pleasure over seeing what people were reading on the bus. But these days, I'm unable to do that without really peeking over their shoulder and remembering the prose that you read. Because now that people are reading e-books with no image to go with the book cover, and it's very blank. Even the font is the same. And so I find that really intriguing as being a voyeur of wanting to know what people are reading. That there's no accompanying image to go with the text as a way of communicating to other people. I mean, I read books I don't want people knowing I'm reading on my e-reader, because I don't want them knowing I'm reading Game of Thrones right now. You know what I mean? But I don't know if that's something that you would like to comment on, or
just read it around.
I love it. I mean, I have a device, Kindle, and I love the luxury of carrying with me 50 books or 100. I'm not reading those books. No? I find myself going back to paper. I tried it, and I was not convinced. Even when I travel, I thought, well, you know, this is a great way of not carrying more stuff with me. But it's me. I'm a very old-fashioned man from the 20th century. I know that my kid is going to relate to books in a different way because he's, you know, doing the tablets and all of that. And it's very natural to him. I was having this conversation with my English 2 students yesterday about the web, and, you know, saying, well, you didn't really grow up with the e-book. No? The e-book is new to you too. It's new to everyone right now. But we don't know what's going to happen with kids who are born into the e-book. No? Kids who won't read at night when they go to bed, you know, Dr. Seuss on paper. They will read Dr. Seuss on a screen. It's going to happen, right? It's going to happen. I'm very optimistic. I think the more we have, the more interesting choices we can make. I love technology. I really do. But I'll choose paper for a while. Yeah. Until maybe the font is not readable and I'll, you know, need to blow it.
You can't read that? The e-reader failed. It didn't. You're not reading on your Kindle.
No, I can't. No, I like the you know, the tactile experience of the book much better. Yeah.
I am with you there too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I need the materiality of some kind, you know. And the books that I like, which are many, that's what I choose to look at them or read them. I deface them. I can never have a book, you know, my library, which has several thousand books, doesn't have very good resale value because it just underlines, you know, side notes, margins, this, the other. I mean, always and I cannot do that in you know, in an ebook. I mean, typically, yeah, you could, but there is something there that somehow, which goes back to a point that you were making about the sensuous. I mean, it just, I mean, there is that tension. I mean, you know, which from Plato onwards, really, you know, the intelligible and the sensible in some ways, it's right there, you know. The whole field of aesthetics from the 18th century rehashes that, you know.
Yeah, but I think they will come up with something better. I do believe that. The e-reader, remember, is like the telephone we used to use with our fingers. That's the equivalent. The current e-reader is that they will come out with something that's going to be very attractive and friendly, something that doesn't distract you so much with, you know, other applications. And I mean, it's hard not to want to check your email in the middle of a chapter. Well, thank you very much for coming.